Is there any evidence that Jesus is the Messiah? Welcome to the Torah Guide podcast. In this series, we're talking about the evidence we have for Jesus and how we can be sure he's the Messiah. In the last episode, I talked about how there's two main reasons that we can really be sure Jesus is the Messiah. The first reason is he meets the expectation that's laid out for the Messiah in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. In other words, he was promised beforehand, and then he fits the promises like a glove. If you're interested in figuring out what the Hebrew Bible actually says about the Messiah and how we can say that so confidently that Jesus did meet the expectation laid out in the Hebrew Bible, even though the majority of the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, don't accept Jesus as the Messiah, check out the Messianic Trajectory series. That's the last podcast series we did, and we walked all the way through that. There is a second reason that we can be sure Jesus is the Messiah, and that is because God raised Jesus from the dead, validating his messianic claim. In this series, we're going to talk about how we know Jesus rose from the dead, how we know this is actually a historical event that really happened, that really took place, and we're going to talk about why this means he's the Messiah. In other words, how one thing in his life, which yes is miraculous and impossible, how if this took place, this actually means he's the Messiah. So that's what we're going to unpack and walk through in this series. In the last episode, we talked about how we even know that Jesus is a real person. So if you're not sure that Jesus is even a real person, maybe you haven't looked into the evidence, or you just don't really know what to do with the evidence, that first video is going to be a great video for you to see how we even know that Jesus is a real person. In this episode, we're going to talk about why his resurrection specifically says that he is the Messiah, why his resurrection means so much. And this is a really important question, and it means a lot to me because I am a Jewish person, and it's this evidence that I'm going to be sharing with you in this series that convinced me that Jesus rose from the dead and that he really is the Messiah. When I was looking into this evidence for myself, it was several months that I was looking into the evidence and trying to figure out what I thought about Jesus. And as a Jewish guy, I had 3 rabbis that I was meeting with on a regular basis and studying with and learning from. And as I was looking into the evidence, I was sharing with them what I was learning and that I was looking into Jesus. And they would ask me questions and would be really thought-provoking discussions to really push me and encourage me to dig more and really get to the bottom of the truth here. And when I finally was convinced that there's so much evidence, and the more evidence I find, the more I'm convinced that this really happened, and the more I'm convinced that the objections to his resurrection are weaker and weaker and misunderstand or ignore evidence. So I finally was convinced that Jesus really rose from the dead, and I told my rabbis this, and I explained it to them why. And one of them asked me, who cares if Jesus rose from the dead? Now, this question might seem crazy to you. You might be like, well, what do you mean, who cares if Jesus rose from the dead? But it's actually a fair question from a Jewish perspective. But before we talk about that, let's just state the obvious. Dead people can't come back to life. It's impossible. So if someone was a teacher, a Jewish man who was a teacher, and claimed that he was going to rise from the dead, this is something he's going to do, and then we have evidence that he actually died and then rose from the dead, that this actually happened, not just have evidence that it happened, but that the full weight of the evidence says that this is a real historical event, then that says a whole lot about him. It's not conclusive by itself, but let's just state the obvious and say dead people can't come back to life. So if this really took place in history, if Jesus really did come back to life, it says a whole lot. It's not something to just go, yeah, whatever, and just move on. It's something that's worth looking into. But like I said, it's a fair question from a Jewish perspective because Jesus really isn't even the only resurrection in his own story. In the Bible, over the course of the Hebrew Bible and also in the New Testament, he's not the only resurrection. There is a common misconception or maybe a myth in Judaism that one of the reasons we don't believe in Jesus as the Jewish people is because Jewish people don't believe in individual resurrection. So they don't believe in a Messiah who's going to come back to life, who's going to be resurrected. Now, this is actually a very overstated and oversimplification of the Jewish view because there are actually resurrections. There are individual resurrections in the Hebrew Bible. So there is a precedent in Judaism for resurrections. God used Elijah, the prophet, in 1 Kings 17 to resurrect somebody who had died, bring them back to life. God used the prophet Elisha to raise someone from the dead, and that was in 2 Kings 4. And also, God used Elijah, who had already died. So in this prophet's death, Elisha's death, God raised somebody to life who was dead and thrown into Elisha's tomb. And when the body came in contact with Elisha's bones, it came back to life. So even at death, Elisha, this prophet, God used them to bring somebody back to life. So there is a precedent in Judaism for resurrection. And there's even a precedent for in death, God using somebody to resurrect. And the point there is that the story about Jesus' teachings, is that by his death, he brings resurrection life to himself and his followers. Through his death, life comes to the world. And that story, the second story with Elisha, is 2 Kings 13. But Jesus isn't even the only resurrection in the New Testament. Lazarus raised from the dead. Jesus himself brings Lazarus back to life. So the point is, it's a fair question to ask, how does Jesus' resurrection, if this even really happened, how does that mean he's the Messiah? And it's a fair question because he's not the only resurrection. Nobody thinks that the people Elijah brought back to life are the Messiah. Nobody thinks that the people Elisha brought back to life are the Messiah. And nobody thinks that Lazarus is the Messiah. So how can we think that Jesus is the Messiah? It's a fair question. And the reason is because Jesus made radical claims about himself. He claimed and was teaching that he was somebody specific, that he really was the Messiah, and that as the Messiah that God promised to Israel, that the prevailing interpretations of the Messiah at the time by the Jewish people only had a partial view of the picture, and that the full picture of the Messiah, as promised in the Hebrew Bible, as Jesus was interpreting the Hebrew Bible, is that the Messiah is God himself, that was revealing himself to the people of Israel, and to welcome in all of the nations to be a part of this plan, to be a part of this messianic salvation, messianic rescue that God was bringing to the world. So Jesus' resurrection says a whole lot because he promised it beforehand as the sign that would show who he really is. And dead people don't come back to life, so it goes a long way in validating his claim. Now, Jesus didn't just appear in a vacuum in history. He appeared to a very specific people with a specific history, and this people already had a self-understanding that God was using them, that the God of the universe, the creator of the world, was partnering with this specific people group. He made a covenant with them for a reason to do something specific in the world. Now, Jesus enters the scene of history through this people. Jesus is a Jewish man, and he claimed that everything he was doing was the carrying forward of all the promises in his people's history. In other words, he claimed that the Hebrew Bible was about him. The Old Testament was about him. And so this gives us an extra layer to test. Is he really the Messiah? Because if he is who he says he is, if the resurrection proves who he says he is, then he should line up with what the Hebrew Bible says. And in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, God gives criteria to the Jewish people to test whether what a prophet says is true or if it's false. This is actually something that is thrown up a lot as an objection to Jesus. So I just wanted to bring us to this passage, Deuteronomy 13, and see the standards that God gives for verifying or falsifying someone who claims to speak for God. Okay, so this is what Deuteronomy 13 says. Deuteronomy 13, 1 through 3. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes true of which he spoke to you, saying, let's follow other gods, whom you have not known, and let's serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God is testing you to find out whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Okay, so what is this saying? If a prophet gives you a sign or a wonder, a miracle, and in the context here, this is coming to the people of Israel through the prophet Moses, who is known for his signs and wonders. So this is not saying signs and wonders are bad. In fact, God used signs and wonders in Exodus 3 and 4 to show Moses that he is God. And then God told Moses to do the signs that he had shown Moses to the people of Israel so that they would know that Moses is a prophet of God. So in Exodus 3 and 4, God uses Moses or God uses signs and wonders to show the people of Israel that Moses is a prophet. So here in Deuteronomy 13, it says, if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes true, and he says, let's follow other gods, then don't listen to that prophet. Okay, so here's what this is saying. If there's a prophet who says, hey, let's follow other gods, and then he performs signs and wonders, those signs and wonders don't mean anything. And it says, for the Lord your God is testing you to find out whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. So if you follow other prophets who say, let's follow other gods, and they're performing signs and wonders, this is actually leaving God. It's showing that you don't love the Lord, Hashem, with all your heart, with all your soul, because you're following prophets who say, let's follow other gods. Okay, so this almost seems to minimize the importance of signs and wonders, which doesn't really add up with the fact that God used signs and wonders to show the prophet Moses was really speaking for him. Well, this isn't the only standard in the Torah for verifying or falsifying prophets. There's another place, only a couple chapters later, Deuteronomy 18, that also talks about how to verify prophets. And this gives us a fuller picture of how to verify or falsify a prophet. Now, we'll talk about both passages, and then we'll look at Jesus and see which passage talks about Jesus. Which passage can we use to verify or falsify Jesus and his claims? So Deuteronomy 18, verses 20 to 22. But the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, a word which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And if you say in your heart, how will we recognize the word which the Lord, Hashem, has not spoken? When the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, and the thing does not happen or come true, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. Okay, so in this chapter, the people are saying, well, how do we recognize the word which the Lord has not spoken? How will we recognize a false prophet? And God's answer is, when the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, and that thing does not happen. So this time, if the prophet is speaking in the name of the Lord, and this is the divine name for that the Jewish people substitute Hashem or Adonai or the Lord in all caps because this name is treated so holy or considered so holy. If someone claims to speak in this name, in God's name, and they promise that something is going to take place and it doesn't take place, that means this person is not a prophet. Which means if they claim to speak in the name of God, how would you verify them? If the thing does take place, that means they do speak for God. So if we look at these two passages, right? The one says, if they say, hey, let's follow other gods, and they make a prophecy, don't even worry about the prophecy because they've told you let's follow other gods. So they have outed themselves as a false prophet. So someone who says, let's follow other gods, whether their sign or wonder, miracle comes true or not, they're not of God. They're a false prophet. But if they speak in God's name, the way that you'll know that they're a prophet or not is if their sign comes true or not. If they speak in God's name and there's a miracle that they perform, God verifies them. That's true. If they speak in God's name and their sign or wonder does not come true, according to the Torah, then they're not from God. So the question is, did Jesus speak in the name of the Lord, or did he say, let's follow other gods? And if he spoke in the name of the Lord, then did his sign or wonder come true? Now I hope you can begin to see why Jesus' resurrection, this event, means so much. And it's because Jesus promised his death and resurrection beforehand. So we're going to figure out, did Jesus speak in the name of the Lord, or did he say, let's follow other gods? And did he promise his resurrection beforehand, and then did his resurrection actually happen? So I want to show you that that is true. Jesus promised his death and resurrection beforehand, and then it actually took place. And we have enough evidence that this took place, even though it should be impossible. So in Mark 9:31, Jesus said this, the Son of Man, this is his favorite title for himself. He always calls himself the Son of Man. We'll talk about that in a second. The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. This is Mark 9:31. So Jesus, this is an instance of Jesus teaching his disciples soon before his crucifixion, his execution, on the holiday of Passover. He says, the Son of Man is to be handed over to men, they will kill him, and when he's been killed, he will rise 3 days later. Now, in the next episode, we're actually going to talk about how we know Mark is an early and trustworthy source. But this is an instance of Jesus teaching that he is going to be killed. This is why he came, and then he's going to rise again. He says this many, many times. In Matthew 12:38-42 is another instance, and this is a really specific, really important instance of him promising his resurrection beforehand, because in this promise, he actually calls it a sign. He references the story of Jonah and how Jonah went into the fish and talked about being in the grave in Sheol, and how God, the fish spit him up, and this was life again for him. Jesus used this as a metaphor or an analogy to explain what was going to happen to him. And what Jesus says is, it's a sign that his death and resurrection would be the sign given to the Jewish people that he is who he said he is. That is in Matthew 12:38-42. But he also promises it many other places. Matthew 16:21-23, Matthew 17:22-23, and 20:17-19, Mark 8:31-32, Mark 10:32-34, and there's other places where before his death, before his execution, Jesus promised that he would in fact be executed and that he would rise again, showing that his claims were true. So Jesus, before his death, promised this would happen. So this is a sign, according to the Torah. The standards that mean if a prophet is true or false is if they say, let's follow other gods, and they perform a sign, don't even worry about their signs. But if they speak in the name of the Lord, then their sign is going to tell you if they are a true prophet or a false prophet. If the sign doesn't come true, they're a false prophet. That means if it does come true and they speak in the name of the Lord, then they are a true prophet. So let's see what Jesus said about himself. Did he speak in the name of the Lord? Did he think he was the Messiah? How do we know that Jesus really thought he was the Messiah and that his resurrection backs up that claim? So Jesus said, this is in Matthew 16, and this account of what Jesus is about to say here is in Matthew, it's in Mark, and it's in Luke. So it's trustworthy stories. It's repeated in 3 different accounts. Jesus asks the question, who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ. This is a translation of Messiah. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. So basically, Jesus asks his disciples, who do you think that I am? And one of them answers, you are the Messiah. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus approves of this answer. He says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because this didn't come from man. People didn't tell you this. This was revealed to you by my Father who is in heaven. In other words, God revealed to you that I am the Messiah. So Jesus is here claimed to be the Messiah. And this is a story that is repeated in 3 gospel accounts. So Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. There's another one more place I want to look at. This is not the only place Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. If you read through the New Testament, you'll see him claim to be the Messiah in various ways, implicitly and explicitly, multiple times. But this is one of the most important moments where he claimed to be the Messiah. This is in Mark 14. This is the earliest gospel account. So it says, again, the high priest was questioning him and said to him, are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Jesus answers straight up, I am, when he's asked to be the Messiah. And then he goes even further and says, you shall see the Son of Man, which is the same name that we talked about earlier. Jesus called himself the Son of Man. He says, you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. So the Son of Man is a title that comes from the book of Daniel. And this is a prophecy about a divine human person who's descending with God or descending to God and takes his seat on the throne next to God. So this is someone who's a divine human figure. So claiming to be the Son of Man is claiming to be one with God himself. It's claiming divinity. So this is a massive claim that Jesus makes, and he ties it together with being the Messiah. So Jesus' understanding of the Messiah is more than just being the Messiah, it's being one with God, as Jesus interpreted the Hebrew Bible. So now his resurrection says a whole lot. If he really resurrected from the dead, this is validating his claim that he's the Messiah, and that his interpretation of the Messiah is that he is God. So there's one more thing I want to look at. Did Jesus claim to speak in the name of the Lord, or did Jesus claim to say, hey, let's follow other gods? What did Jesus teach? Following the Lord or following other gods? Again, this is going to tell us, according to the Torah standards, if we should trust him as a prophet and believe what he said, or if we should reject what he said. So this is in John chapter 8. Now, throughout the New Testament, throughout the gospel accounts, Jesus claimed to be one with the God of Israel. He claimed to be the God that the Jewish people have known all along. So he's not claiming to follow other gods. This is taught in many places. I'm just going to, for the sake of getting through this conversation and talking about all the points we want to talk about, I'm only going to show you one place where this happens. But throughout the gospel accounts, in John chapter 1, the gospel author talks about how Jesus is God. In Mark chapter 1, the gospel author talks about how Jesus is God and that Elijah prepared the way for him. Jesus implicitly and explicitly claims to be the God of Israel. He forgives sin, something that he knows that only God can do. So let's talk about this one specific instance where Jesus uses the divine name of God, the same name that God of Israel revealed to Moses at the burning bush as who he is. Jesus says it about himself. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, this is called the Septuagint. This is before Jesus. The Jewish people translated the Bible into Greek so that it could be widespread read amongst the Jewish people who were still in diaspora after the Babylonian exile. And so this Jewish translation of the Bible, when they translated Exodus 3 and 4, and they translated God's name, and throughout the Bible, when they translated the name of God, they translated it as ego eimi, ego eimi. And so here, the New Testament is also written in Greek, and it uses, almost every time that the New Testament uses or quotes from the Hebrew Bible, it's quoting from the Septuagint because that is the Greek translation, and the New Testament is written in Greek. So, here's what Jesus said. This is John chapter 8, 53 to 59. So he's talking with some Jewish people, and they ask him, they realize that he's claiming to be someone more important than the prophets and even more important than Abraham, and they think he's claiming to be one with God himself. They think he's claiming to be the Messiah and a bigger version of Messiah than anyone anticipated. And they say, "You are not greater than our father Abraham who died, are you? The prophets died too. Whom do you make yourself out to be?" Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. And you have not come to know him, but I know him. And if I say that I do not know him, I will be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I follow his word. Your father Abraham was overjoyed that he would see my day, and he saw it and rejoiced." So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, ego eimi, I am. Before Abraham was, I am." Therefore they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and left the temple grounds. So let's talk about what's happening here. First off, Jesus is talking to a group of Jewish people. He's not talking to all Jewish people. In fact, at this point in time, all of Jesus' followers, all the people who believe in him, are Jewish. So it's wrong to look at this passage and think that Jesus is criticizing all Jewish people. That's not what's taking place. He's talking to a specific group of people at a specific time. And they are rejecting him. They do not accept him. They do not accept him as a prophet of God. And he's saying that this is because they are not following God. If they were following God, they would accept him. If they were following God according to knowledge, they would know that he really is who he says he is. And who Jesus says that he is here, he's claiming to be more than Abraham. And they pick this up and they say, "You're not 50 years old and you've seen Abraham?" They know what he's getting at. And Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So we can see that this is incorrect grammar, right? Before Abraham was born, I was would be correct grammar. So Jesus is saying that before Abraham was born, he was, but he doesn't use the word I was. He says ego eimi, which is the name of God. So he's using the name of God in this sentence to call attention to, he's not only saying that he was before Abraham, he's using the name of God that means eternal. He's saying he is the eternal one. He's saying that he is the God of Israel that Abraham interacted with and knew. And they understand what he's saying. So that's why verse 59 says, "Therefore they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and left the temple grounds." So they realized that Jesus was claimed to be the God of Israel. This is so blasphemous that if he's wrong, if he's not the God of Israel, this is blasphemous. And they thought he was wrong. They thought he was lying. So they pick up stones to stone him. So Jesus, did he claim to say, "Let's follow other gods"? No. He's saying that he is the same God of Israel that the Jewish people have known since the father of the Jewish people, Abraham. And he's saying that he is the God of Israel and he's the creator of the universe, because before Abraham, before the Jewish people was, Ego Ami, the name of the Lord, right? Okay, so Jesus claimed to speak in the name of Israel, Jesus claimed to speak in the name of the Lord, in the name of the God of Israel, just like Deuteronomy 18 says, if they speak in the name of the Lord, then their signs are going to tell you if they're a true prophet or a false prophet. So now we see that Jesus did not say, let's follow other gods. He claimed to be the God of Israel. So he spoke in the name of the Lord as much as anybody can speak in the name of the Lord, saying, I am the person who is the name of the Lord, right? So this is why we're going to look into what Jesus promised beforehand, the resurrection, and see if the resurrection really happened. Because if the resurrection, the thing that Jesus promised beforehand as his sign, he said is the sign of Jonah, his resurrection, then this is going to tell us if he really is a true prophet. And because he claimed to be the Messiah, as we saw, it's going to show that he is the Messiah. Because Jesus' messianic claim and all the teachings of the New Testament rest on this specific historical event, Jesus' resurrection. So I hope you can see that his resurrection validates his claim to be the Messiah, and it validates his interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, and it shows he spoke for God. Because the Torah lays out standards for determining if a prophet is true or false. And the standard is, if you say, let's follow other gods, don't even listen to the signs. But if you speak in the name of the Lord, like Jesus, saying he is the Lord, then their sign or wonder is going to tell you if they are true or false. So now the sign that Jesus promised is his resurrection. So if his resurrection really happened, then the things he claimed about himself, that he's a divine son of man from the book of Daniel, that he's the Christ, the Messiah, these things all of a sudden are verified, validated by God as true. Because God is not a liar. He's not going to say, this is how you verify a false prophet, and then give you a sign to trick you into thinking that he's a real prophet, even though that's not what he said he would do in the Torah. So this is why it matters so much. Okay, so there's nothing for it. Now it's time to look at the evidence we have, the information that we have stored for us from the past, and see if we have enough to know that Jesus actually did rise from the dead. What I want to show you guys is that the historical evidence is so sound that we really can be convinced that this thing that should be impossible actually did happen. That following the evidence where it leads and not deciding things based on a bias we have or what we want to happen, or we want to have happened, we're going to see that the truth is he really did rise from the dead. That is the best explanation of the historical evidence we have. And a rejection of Jesus' resurrection is not actually accepting the evidence, it's ignoring the evidence. That's how much we know about his resurrection. So to illustrate how convincing the evidence is that Jesus rose from the dead, how sound the whole body of evidence is around Jesus' resurrection is that it really took place, I want to tell you guys about Pinchas Lapide. He was an Orthodox rabbi from the previous century who wrote a book about the resurrection of Jesus in the 1970s. Now, Pinchas Lapide is an Orthodox Jewish rabbi who never accepted Jesus as the Messiah. But despite every predisposition to the contrary, Pinchas Lapide looked at the evidence for Jesus' resurrection and found it so convincing that he came to the conclusion that Jesus' resurrection is an actual historical event that really did take place, even though he never believed in Jesus. So I want to recommend his book. It's A Resurrection of Jesus, A Jewish Perspective by Pinchas Lapide. It'll be a great read. It's a short read, and it explains why he thinks that Jesus' resurrection is something that actually took place in history. And as he looked into the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, he realized that it is well situated inside the Jewish outlook, the Jewish worldview, that his resurrection, if you read it in the New Testament, actually, despite common misconceptions, is a very Jewish thing. This is a very Jewish event. I want to be clear that historians have a lot of different opinions about Jesus' resurrection. So not all historians agree that Jesus resurrected, of course. The disagreement, though, is not about the events themselves, the evidence we have stored for us in history. The disagreement is about how to explain the events we know took place. Okay, so there's a scholar named William Lane Craig. He's a Christian scholar who's done a lot of work surveying what different historians have said about Jesus' resurrection. And what he's found is that the historians who specialize in the New Testament time period widely agree that the following events, the events that I'll talk about in a second, are well established. In other words, whether or not they accept the resurrection actually took place, they do accept that these four things did take place. Not all the historians agree on each of the events, but overall, historians widely agree that all four of these did take place. First, that Jesus was killed by Roman crucifixion and buried in a Sanhedrin member's tomb. That after his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was discovered empty by a group of his women followers. Third, that after his crucifixion, individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of him alive. And fourth, that Jesus' earliest followers sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. These four events that William Lane Craig has surveyed different historians on, that historians widely agree that each of these things happened, are that Jesus was killed, crucified, buried in a specific tomb, that after his execution, that tomb was discovered empty, people experienced appearances of him alive after his execution, and that those people, his earliest followers, despite every precondition to the contrary, as Jewish people who did not expect an individual resurrection or a Messiah that would die and then rise from the dead, they didn't expect this, and they were devastated by Jesus' crucifixion only days earlier, sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So this is quite an amazing thing that historians widely agree on. So in the rest of the series, we're going to talk about why we know that those things took place, how we know Jesus was crucified, how we know that he was really buried in a Sanhedrin member's tomb, how we know that that tomb was really discovered empty, and how we know that people actually did experience appearances of him, and how we know that his earliest followers sincerely believed that he had risen from the dead. We're going to talk about how this is so convincing, and you'll see why Pinchas Lapide, an Orthodox rabbi, looked into the historical evidence and thought this actually did take place, as something that really happened. And what I want to make clear is the best explanation of this well-established evidence is that Jesus really did rise from the dead. So many people reject Jesus' resurrection because they don't believe miracles are possible. They'll look at all this evidence and they'll see everything we have and they'll ignore it and they'll go, look, it's just not possible. Resurrections don't happen. But what that means, what you're doing when you say that I don't believe resurrections are possible, so I'm going to reject Jesus, is you're not rejecting Jesus based on the evidence. You're not rejecting Jesus based on truth and knowledge. You're rejecting Jesus because you're ignoring the knowledge, you're ignoring the evidence, because it doesn't fit into your preconceived worldview. But if it's at least possible that God exists, if it's possible that God exists, then it is possible that resurrections can happen. Because you can't say resurrections are impossible unless you know that God's not real. Because if there's a God who created the universe, if there's a creator, then a miracle would be no problem for the one who could create everything that exists, create life in the world to begin with. It'd be no problem for him to raise someone back to life. This would be child's play for him. So if God is at least possible, then the person who claimed to be God and then said he would rise from the dead to prove it, that goes a long way in validating his claim and showing that he really is who he said he is. I hope you can already begin to see that the resurrection of Jesus is a historically reliable event. There's a reason that historians, Christian or not, agree on the events around Jesus' resurrection by and large. I hope you can begin to see that there is a reason that someone like Pinchas Lapide, an Orthodox rabbi who has every predisposition to the contrary, can look at the evidence for Jesus' resurrection and see that this is something that really took place. And I hope that the wheels start turning and you start to keep in mind through this series that people don't just die and come back to life, but Jesus did. I hope that the historical reliability of Jesus' resurrection impels you to then study what Jesus taught, to open the New Testament for yourself, and you'll read through what he taught in the New Testament and see how his teachings are verified by his resurrection. I hope you'll let the weight of the impossible actually taking place compel you to go and study what he taught. And his resurrection should give you the confidence that he really is who he claimed to be. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the dating of the Gospels, when the four Gospel accounts, the four biographies of Jesus were written, and how we know they can be trusted as historical sources and to what extent we should really trust them as historical sources. And then in the next few episodes, we'll unpack each of those events that we talked about today, how we know that Jesus was crucified, how we know that he died by crucifixion and was buried in a Sanhedrin member's tomb, how we know that tomb was really discovered empty, how we know that that people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his crucifixion, and how we know that his disciples, his earliest followers, were sincerely convinced that he had really risen from the dead. So that's what we're going to unpack in the next few episodes. Again, I want to remind you guys that the Torah Guide is 100% crowdfunded. So everything we do, all these videos, all the resources we put out are 100% funded by people like you who have benefited from the content and who believe in what we're doing, reaching people with the gospel, sharing the gospel by teaching the Hebrew Bible and showing how the Hebrew Bible is all about Jesus and helping people discover Jesus for themselves. So if you believe in this content, if it's been helpful for you, or if you know people who would be beneficial for, or if you believe in this mission at all, I really want to encourage you to be a part of what we're doing. I never want to pressure anybody to give more than they're able to. I want to make that very clear. But I do want to invite you to be a part of this. And our biggest need right now is for monthly financial partners. We really need help to be able to continue doing this. So you can give at thetorahguide.com/give. So thank you guys very much. Looking forward to the next episode where we talk about when the Gospels were written.